Welcome to Mr. Mutlow's Topic in 10 Minutes for A2 OCR Physical Education. This video is concerned with the historical studies element of the course. In specific terms, we will cover the characteristics and ideas that make up popular recreation. Popular recreation refers to sport which occurred before the Industrial Revolution, in the early 1800s, or perhaps even earlier than that. For that reason, it is sometimes referred to as pre-industrial. One excellent example of a sport which made up popular recreation would be mob football. When considering this part of the course, the first thing to pay attention to are the features of pre-industrial society. In simple terms, what was life like before the Industrial Revolution? There are 8 features which it would be helpful to know. The first of these features is a lack of technology. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, there was limited mechanical machinery to make life easier or make jobs more simple. There was very limited technology and life was primitive. If you imagine the amount of technology which is present in society today, and think what it may have been like in the late 1870s, you would be considering post-industrial society. Imagine, therefore, what it must have been like to live before the Industrial Revolution. A second feature would be limited transport and communication. Pre-industrial Britain was a time when there were no aeroplanes or cars, and the train had not yet become an important feature. This meant that most travel was done either by foot or by horse and cart. Equally, the telephone had not been invented, and therefore messages were carried around the country in mail carts or by people walking in the form of messengers. It was therefore very difficult for people to move out of their own town or to communicate with those who lived a long way away. Life was based around individual rural villages. That brings us to our third feature, the harsh rural lifestyle. The economy at the time was based on agriculture, and people farmed for their living. This is a fourth feature of pre-industrial society, agriculture. I will seek to explain these two features in slightly more detail now. It is important to understand that in the time period we are talking about, sustenance living was a way of life. In simple terms, that means that people lived on what they were able to grow or farm. There were a limited number of shops where you could buy produce, and clearly transport did not allow you to go to a local supermarket or large superstore as we would today. Therefore, people lived on what they could grow on their own farm. Obviously, if the harvest failed or the crops were bad, people struggled to survive. Hence the lifestyle was harsh and rural and based on agriculture or farming. Equally, there was widespread illiteracy in society. Clearly, not many people went to school in this time, and this may not seem particularly relevant in society in general. After all, in the early 1800s, the ability to farm is not limited by the ability to read and write. That said, we are concerned with the study of sport, and widespread illiteracy made it difficult for people to write down rules and for rules to be played commonly across different areas of the country. Therefore, it is important to note that people at this time were largely illiterate, unless of course they were from the upper class, and therefore this had an impact on sport and games. Society at the time was also two-tier, with two dominant classes. There were the gentry and the landowners at the top of the tree, and the peasants, or the lower class, at the bottom. Landowners rarely worked, they merely survived on the rent from their land, whilst the peasants, or the lower class, did much of the work and the farming to allow the lord to continue to live. As time progressed, this became less and less common, of course, and was not quite like the medieval method in which I have described it, but it is clear that society was made up of those who had money, wealth and influence, and those who did not. In simple terms, there was no middle class. Due to the rural nature of society, and the fact that there was little transport between communities, There was also a lack of policing evident at the time. As each individual community existed as a separate entity, it had its own traditions and customs, and therefore one widespread police force was very difficult to coordinate and manage. That is not to say that there was no discipline or law and order, rather that each individual landowner was the judge, jury and executioner in their own parish or small area. Some skeleton police forces existed, but generally society was uncivilised and lacked the discipline of modern day life. The final feature of pre-industrial society, which is important to consider, is the influence of seasonal time on people's work habits. Nowadays, we would expect to have consistent work patterns and generally work between the same hours on each day. This would be consistent across a year. Back in pre-industrial Britain, however, amounts of work were dictated by the seasons, hence seasonal time. At harvest time, there was more work to do to ensure the crops you needed to eat, and therefore in order to live, were correctly processed, collected and stored. However, at other times of the year, there was less to do, and therefore free time was neither guaranteed nor consistent. This made the organisation of sport and games very difficult, as there was a limited period of time when all people would be free to participate. In simple terms, participation could only happen on holy days and bank holidays. Having identified the features of pre-industrial society, you may now be able to identify some characteristics of popular recreation. If this is not the case, don't panic, as we are about to identify these together now. The characteristics of popular recreation reflect the features of pre-industrial society, and so you will see that in essence they are cause and effect. Take for example seasonal time. Due to the lack of time available for people to play sport, popular recreation was occasional. It mainly happened on high days and holy days, as these were the only times where the community could get together. Therefore, the cause was the fact that there was seasonal time. The effect is that popular recreation became occasional. Likewise, due to the fact there was widespread illiteracy, one of the characteristics of popular recreation was that it had simple, unwritten rules. Any game with complicated rules that required some kind of explanation or book to go with them often found itself falling by the wayside, as many people could neither understand nor read the rules and regulations. Equally, the lack of civilization and policing in society meant that many of the games played as part of popular recreation were cruel and violent in nature. They were in essence a reflection of society. As there was limited transport and communication in society, popular recreation was a local participation only activity. That is, there were not widespread fixtures between neighbouring towns or cities, as it was difficult to get from one town to another. Therefore it was played locally within a village or a community. As we will discover later, it was only with the advent of the train and the improvement in transport links brought about by the Industrial Revolution that widespread fixtures between different towns and cities and their clubs became commonplace. Due to a lack of technology, the facilities used for popular recreation were often natural or simple. Many games involved natural features of a town or village, such as a river or a building, and did not necessarily have all-seater stadia or other technology that we expect today. People played wherever there was space and using whatever they could find. As society was rural, so too popular recreation was rural, and it often involved the countryside or the surrounding area around a town or village. That goes without saying, and really needs little explanation. Equally, the two-class society which existed meant that games were either courtly or popular. This means that games either appealed to the masses, for example mob football, or appealed to the gentry and were exclusively played by them. Real tennis would be an example here, where only the gentry could afford a court and the equipment, and by and large only those who could read could understand the rules. Therefore, some games were designed for the masses and some for the gentry. Some games were courtly and some games were popular. The final characteristic of popular recreation was that wagering was widespread. Put simply, people in pre-industrial Britain loved to gamble and to show off their wealth or to bet upon performers. That being so, almost all sport involved some kind of betting or wagering from the upper class on the performance of the lower class. We will see more of this later when we discuss pedestrianism and athletics and swimming and bathing. If you are able to identify the features of pre-industrial society and link these to the characteristics of popular recreation, you should be well equipped to attempt any question on this topic area. Remember that popular recreation refers to sport or games prior to the Industrial Revolution. That concludes the topic in 10 minutes for popular recreation.